How does a DSLR work? DSLR is it for me? Is it easy to use?
Well, if you had all those queries stopping you from buying a DSLR and unleashing your creativity, we are here to help you. I am Rohan from Nikon India technical team. We at Nikon have always believed in nurturing the photography talent and providing our customers a great photography experience. We have an array of options like Nikon school workshops, photo walks, outdoor workshops. And now taking it a step forward, we bring to you Nikon School DSLR tutorials. Through the course of these tutorials, we will be talking about the basics of photography, which will help aspiring photographers strengthen their photography skills. The first session talks about DSLR advantages and why should one own a DSLR. At the same time, we share with you some important facts as well as try and answer some common myths about photography. I would like to introduce to you Abhishek, my colleague from the Nikon India technical team. Abhishek, we get a lot of questions from our customers asking about why should one buy a DSLR camera. You know, they think it's complex and difficult to use, and why should actually one invest in a DSLR?
Ron, I tell you, most of the people who want to upgrade from a compact camera to a DSLR have this question that DSLR is a very complex machine. But if you actually use a DSLR, or if you actually get a demonstration of a DSLR, you will find that it's the most simplest machine to understand in terms of photography. Now, we have prepared a small animation piece which will help you and customers to understand that how actually DSLR functions. Great. Once you understand that, even it is very helpful for people who own a DSLR right now. That will give a very clear picture to these DSLR owners as well as the people who want to upgrade to a new DSLR, that how it works, so that they can get the best output from your DSLR. Now, here we have an animation piece that shows a subject under the influence of light. Now, normally we say if you want to record any picture, you require light for that particular picture. If you don't have light, you cannot grab a picture. Here we have used sun as a natural source of light hitting the subject. Now, from the subject, light travels through the lens, hits a mirror inside the camera. Now, if you see closely, there is a mirror inside this camera. Can you see that?
Yes.
Now, light hits this mirror, get reflected onto the prism which is right on the top of the DSLR, and then further travels to the viewfinder.
That's how we view the image.
Exactly, that's how you view the image. Now, in order to shoot an image, what you do is you first look through the viewfinder, set the exposure mode, could be any auto mode like macro, portrait, sports, or some of the auto exposure modes like manual, then your aperture priority, shutter priority, programmed auto, these kind of modes. You set the right exposure, then you press the shutter release button here. When you press this button, the mirror goes up and the light directly travels to the image sensor, and that's how image gets recorded on your memory card.
So that was about the working of a DSLR camera. Abhishek, come let's discuss a few advantages of DSLRs.
Of course, Ron, the most important advantage of a DSLR is that you can change lenses. Now, what happens when you change a lens? So, you can change the lens to get various different kind of perspectives. Like if you want to shoot a portrait, you get a very good low lighting lens like a 50 mm 1.8, which is a fixed focal length. Fixed focal length means you have a fixed focal length in terms of zoom.
So, you cannot zoom in or zoom out.
Since it's a low lighting performance lens, it's a fixed focal length. Now, here I have a new Nikon D5300 camera mounted with 18 140 mm lens. Now, this lens is a zoom lens which starts from 18 mm wide angle and goes up to 140 mm.
Wow.
Right. So, you can actually change the perspective even without changing the lenses by just zooming into the subject, depending on the situation. Like if you are shooting a wildlife, most of the wildlife photographers prefer to have high focal length of 500 mm, 600 mm, because that's the situation and condition they want to shoot in.
So you can change the look and feel of the shot.
Exactly. Now we have an example here. If you could look at the image here, the first image shows a zoomed in view of a landscape.
Yes.
Okay. Now the same landscape, if we just zoom out to wide angle perspective, you get an altogether different perspective.
Yes, this is completely changed.
So one lens is offering you two different perspectives of the same subject. So that is the major advantage of having a DSLR.
So you can zoom in, zoom out, and by that you can change the perspective and look of the scene.
Exactly. And depending on the kind of subject you are shooting, you can opt for various other lenses we have in our lineup. And as you know, Nikon lenses are world famous for their quality.
What could be other advantages that we could share with our viewers?
See, DSLR, people normally go for a DSLR for high image quality. Now, when we talk about high image quality, that is possible because of the sensor size of the DSLR. Now, we have DSLR starting from 24 megapixel, 36 megapixel, D800 is a 36 megapixel camera. Now, that high resolution gives you the highest quality possible. Now, you will say, Rohan, even some of the smart devices today are having high megapixel of 20 megapixel,
Correct,
24 megapixel. But that megapixel, that image quality is totally different from what quality is offered by your DSLR, because the DSLR sensor is very big as compared to the sensor deployed in these smart devices.
I'm sure our viewers will love this tip because they always have this apprehension about why not use a smart device, why go in for a DSLR when you get the same megapixels.
Let me tell you, a 8 megapixel DSLR will always give you a better quality image compared to any other smart device, even if the smart device is 16 megapixel or 20 megapixel, just because the sensor size of the DSLR is very big. Now, to explain that, I have an image here on the screen. You can see this image. This is a portrait shot taken at Ladakh at Khardungla Pass. Now, if you see closely, if you crop this image more than 50% and you can see the cropped version of this image, you can still retain all those details and sharpness in the image. This is because of the image sensor deployed in a DSLR. This is not possible with any other smart device that is capable of taking an image.
Okay, so that is indeed a great advantage.
Exactly.
So you can blow this picture up also?
You can actually print this image. This is a high quality print image. You can print this image A4, A3 or even on canvas.
Wow, that is a great advantage to have in a DSLR. So those were advantages, some very important advantages of DSLRs. What could be another very critical advantage that could be of help to our users, DSLR users?
Ron, most of the people, they have a lot of complaint that when they shoot in low lighting situation, image appears very dark. And that happens with all the imaging devices, but not with DSLRs. So if you have a good DSLR with a CMOS sensor deployed in it, which is a very high quality sensor, now in these kind of situations, you can actually click an image where there is very minimum light.
That is possible.
Yes. Now here is an image. You can see this image. This image has been shot at Pangong Lake in Ladakh at around 11 PM at night. Now you can see stars on the sky and there is a pretty well lit up landscape in the background, Now you can even see the shadows of the flag. The light that what you see on your screen in the image is not an artificial light.
That was going to be my next question, because you said Ladakh and Pangong. I don't think there are street lights there.
There are no street lights there, there are no bulbs there.
And this is a well lit image.
Yeah, and flash cannot give this kind of output, right? So you have this light which is a moonlight.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So what we have done is we have just mounted a camera on a tripod and exposed the camera for a longer duration for say around 30 seconds. And we used a remote to click this image. You can see the quality of the image, you can see the landscape, you can see the mountains, the mountain range. And if you are there actually at night, you won't be able to see anything. It's pitch dark.
But in this image, we can clearly see and even, kind of make out the texture of the mountains and in the image what kind of a rocky landscape it would have been.
Exactly, and the only light available there was the moonlight. So this is the kind of quality offered by a DSLR. This cannot be matched by any other imaging device, be it smart device or your cell phones or mobile phones.
Abhishek, that was great information about the low light capability of our cameras. But somewhere while explaining the image, you mentioned that you used a remote to take the image. Can you shed some light for the benefit of our viewers on the accessories that our DSLRs come with?
Ron, see, we've spoken about the kind of lenses you can use in various kind of situations. We have wide variety of Nikon lenses, high quality Nikon lenses. If you are a wildlife photographer, as I said, you have big zoom lenses, 500 mm, 600 mm, and recently we introduced 800 mm in our lineup. Along with that, we have very good low lighting performance lens like 50 mm, which is very good for portraits and products. We have 35 mm. We have very wide angle lenses like 14-24, 16 mm fisheye. So depending on the kind of subject you are shooting, you can actually opt for various lenses. Now, apart from lenses, as you mentioned, remotes. Remote is just one accessory that one can opt for while shooting in low lighting situation. Remotes are very helpful when you want to trigger your camera remotely, because at times when you are shooting in extremely low lighting situation, you have to pull down your shutter speed really slow. In those kind of situation, even touching the shutter release button might give you image blur.
So you mean to say camera can shake and cause the
Exactly.
image
So you
to-
can use remote in those situations. So that is the utility of having a remote. Then we have wireless mobile adapters, which can get fixed in the USB port of a DSLR, and then you can wirelessly transfer your images from the camera to any smart devices. That could be Android based or that could be iOS based device.
So that gives us the capability of sharing it with our loved ones on
Yes.
social networking sites.
Exactly. And if you are very fond of utilizing the full HD video capability of our DSLR, we also have a high quality sound recorder that is called ME1 microphone. So you can actually record high quality sound with that microphone. We have GPS devices, we have external flash guns, SB910, these are some of very great flash that can illuminate any low lighting situation. So endless accessories and endless possibilities and endless advantages of having a DSLR.
Great, Abhishek. So I'm sure all our viewers would agree after listening to all these advantages and will have no apprehensions going in for a DSLR camera. We thank you for watching this session and we hope you enjoyed it. In the further sessions, we are going to talk about basics of photography, where we talk about exposure, we talk about composition, and we talk about focus. Stay tuned for some more informative sessions. Until then, these are your Nikon buddies, Rohan and Abhishek, signing off. Thank you.
My images are overexposed. What is f number? What is the effect of changing f number?
If you have all those queries and questions, we'll help you fine-tune the camera exposure to get the desired result. Welcome everyone to Nikon DSLR tutorial. As in the last session, we discussed about the advantages of DSLRs and how you can make use of your DSLRs. In this episode, we'll be talking about exposure, which is the basis of creating good images. Now in this episode, we'll discuss the concepts about analyzing the light and how you can make use of light to get a properly exposed image. Let's talk about exposure. Exposure technically is based on three parameters, that is aperture, shutter speed and ISO. If we define exposure, exposure is basically allowing just enough light onto the light sensitive medium to ensure the subject is captured with the same level of illumination as it is. So when we talk about light sensitive medium in DSLR, the light sensitive medium is your camera image sensor. So let's have a look at these three images. The first image that you see is over bright image. Technically we call it as overexposed image. The second image that you see is a dark image. Technically we call it as underexposed image. The third image that you see is properly exposed image, and technically we call it as balanced exposure. Talking about the first image, which is an overexposed image. Now let's see how to identify an overexposed image. As you can see from the image, the brighter part of the image, that is the clouds, have been blown out. All the details in the clouds have been blown out. That means an overexposed image shows you as if the brighter part of the image have been blown out and there are no details in the brighter section of the image. That is what we call an overexposed image. It is also very easy to identify underexposed images. As you can see from this image, there are no details in the shadow part of the image. This is what we call an underexposed image. Let us now talk about a balanced exposed image. Here is a perfect example of balanced exposure, wherein you can see the details in the brighter part of the image as well as the darker part of the image. This is what we call a balanced exposed image. At the beginning of this session, we spoke about exposure is based on three components: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's talk about aperture and understand how it works. Aperture is basically a mechanism to control light entering the lens, similar to human iris diaphragm. To make you understand aperture in a better way, I have this Nikon 35mm DX lens, which is a very good low lighting lens. Now if you take out this lens and if you see from the back side of the lens, you'll see a small lever. So in order to see the aperture blades inside the lens, what you can do is you can just push this lever and you will see aperture getting widened up. This is what we call aperture of the lens. So here you have a narrow aperture and here you have a wider aperture. Comparing aperture with human iris diaphragm is very easy. Now when you move inside a cinema hall or a dark theater, initially you don't see anything, everything is pitch dark, and after some time the human eye pupil expands so that it can absorb more light. Similarly, when you move out from a darker situation to a brighter situation, the pupil contracts. The same principle is implemented on a camera lens, which is called aperture. Basically, aperture performs two roles. One, it controls exposure, and second, it controls the depth of field. Coming to the first role of aperture, that is exposure, here is an image which has been shot in low lighting situation. Now in this kind of situation, you require your aperture to be wide open. So that means you require wider aperture if you are shooting in low lighting conditions. Let's see another example of how aperture controls exposure. Here is an image that has been shot in bright daylight situation. Now in this kind of situation, you don't require a wider aperture. So small aperture is what is required in brightly lit situation to get properly exposed image. Let's talk about another role of aperture, that is controlling the depth of field. Here is an image in which you can see the foreground as well as the background both are defocused. This is because we have used a wider aperture here. As you can see in the image, the subject, that is the white horse, is in focus and crisp, sharp, whereas the foreground as well as the background both are defocused. This has been achieved by making the aperture wide open. Keeping the same subject and the same image, if you just keep your aperture small, you will see the foreground as well as the background both will be crisp, sharp. Hence, if you want foreground as well as the background in focus and sharp, you should have a small aperture. How to identify small or wider aperture? Aperture is basically denoted by f number. Smaller f number means wider aperture. Greater f number means smaller aperture. Let's refer this chart to understand aperture in a better manner. Here we have various f numbers starting from f1.4 to 2.8 and further to f22. Now, as you can see from the reference images, the first image that has been shot at f1.4 is an overexposed image because this f number was too wide in the given lighting situation. As we keep on increasing the f number further to 2.8, the outcome is still better, but it's again an overexposed image. You keep on increasing the f number, you keep on making the aperture smaller and smaller. So f5.6 is what that gives us a balanced exposed image. You keep on increasing the f number further, you will get a darker output. So depending on the lighting situation, you decide what kind of f number you should have while shooting an image. Let's see how to change f number in your camera. Here I have a Nikon D3200 mounted with 18105mm kit lens. Now on the lens itself, you'll see some markings stating 3.5 to 5.6. What does this mean? This means when you are at wide angle 18mm, the widest aperture you will get is 3.5, and when you zoom the lens to 105mm, the widest aperture you will get is 5.6. Now in order to make use of it, you have to switch your camera to A mode and start rotating the command dial. As you keep on rotating the command dial, you will see the aperture at 3.5 gives you a wider aperture opening. And you keep on increasing the f number, your aperture starts becoming smaller and smaller. So at f22, probably you will have the smallest aperture. As we discussed, aperture controls both exposure as well as the depth of field. Now let's see some of the example that will give you a brief idea about what f number shall we use in what kind of situations. Here is an image which is a landscape shot. Normally in landscape we require both foreground as well as background crisp sharp. Now in order to do that, you should have a higher f number, of course depending on the lighting situation, so that you can get a small aperture. Now if you are looking for those cinematic effect wherein the background is totally defocused, or technically speaking we have a shallow depth of field. Now in order to achieve shallow depth of field, your aperture should be wide open. f4 gives you a lot of liberty to make your background totally detached from your foreground or subject. Thank you for watching this tutorial. We hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. In next session, we will be talking about another element of exposure which is called shutter speed. Until next time, this is your Nikon buddy Abhishek Singh signing off.
How can I capture a fast-moving subject? Why do my images blur when I shoot in low light? How do I get a softer, milky effect in flowing water?
If you have all these queries and questions, this session will answer all of them. Welcome everyone to another session of Nikon DSLR tutorials. As we discussed in previous session about exposure and the elements of exposure, that is aperture, let's discuss another element of exposure which is called shutter speed. Now what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is mechanism to control light entering the image sensor of your camera. Now shutter speed basically controls the duration of light hitting the camera image sensor. Here you can see in this animation wherein the shutter is not open until and unless you press the shutter release button. Once you press the shutter release button, the light passes through the lens and hits the image sensor, and that's how the image gets recorded in your camera. Now in order to make you understand how shutter speed works in your camera, I have this Nikon D3200 camera. You just have to look here. As you can see just the mirror here because I have not pressed the shutter release button. Once I press the shutter release button, you will see the shutter goes up and you can see the image sensor. That means the light is hitting the image sensor directly. Moving ahead in exposure, shutter speed controls two elements. One, it controls light, and second, it controls the subject movement. To make you understand how shutter speed controls the exposure, let's see some of the examples. Now here is an image. As you can see, this image is pretty dark because it has been shot at 1/200th of a second shutter speed. Now this kind of shutter speed is quite high in the provided lighting situation. Now in this kind of lighting situation, let's see if we slow down the shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. Now this is the output you get at slow shutter speed. So we arrive at a conclusion wherein in low lighting situation you require to shoot at slow shutter speeds. Another example of how shutter speed controls exposure. Here you can see an image that is overexposed. Reason being, it has been shot at a very slow shutter speed. Now in this kind of shutter speed, the camera is exposed to light for a longer duration. Hence, you get overexposed output every time you shoot at in a very brightly lit situation. Now if we further increase the shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, you will see you will get a very balanced exposed image. Hence, we should use higher shutter speed in brightly lit situations. Coming to another role of shutter speed, that is controlling the subject movement. Here is an image that shows a high speed car. Now in order to freeze that kind of subject, you need to shoot at a very high shutter speed. Now this shot has been taken at 1/1200th of a second. So if you want to freeze a subject, you need to increase your shutter speed depending on the speed of the subject. If you shoot this subject at a slower shutter speed of say 1/40th of a second. Now, when you shoot at such a slow shutter speed, you can actually show motion in your image. In order to do that, you need to slow down the shutter speed and follow the subject. Now, how to identify slow and fast shutter speed? Shutter speed is normally denoted in seconds or fraction of a second. Now, slow shutter speed means the shutter will open for a longer duration, that means more light will enter in the image sensor, wherein the faster shutter speed means shutter will drop at a very high speed and less light will hit the image sensor. Here we have a chart that depicts various shutter speed starting from 30 seconds and going up to 1/4000 of a second. In certain high-end cameras, this shutter speed can even go up to 1/8000 of a second. Now, if you see this scale, starting from 30 seconds till 1/60th of a second is what we technically consider as slow shutter speed. Slow shutter speed means more light, better in low lighting situation. Now, starting from shutter speed 1/125th of a second and moving ahead to 1/4000 of a second is what we consider faster shutter speed. That means they are good in freezing the motion as well as in brightly lit situations. Now, let us see with the help of some of the examples that what kind of shutter speed you should keep in what kind of situations. If you want to show those milky effect and motion effect on flowing water, you should shoot it at a slow shutter speed. Now, moving ahead, if you are shooting your daily kind of activities like somebody walking, talking, sitting, in these kind of situation you should follow standard shutter speed ranging from 1/60th of a shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. Now, if you are shooting something that is moving very fast, you have to pull your shutter speed at a high speed. Now, in order to change the shutter speed in this camera, first go to S mode. Once you go to S mode, you have to rotate the command dial. As you keep on rotating the command dial, you will see the shutter speed is changing in the interface of the camera. As we have already discussed how to freeze the subject by increasing the shutter speed. Now, in this example, we will tell you that how slower shutter speed are very useful in low lighting situation. Now, this image has been shot at a very slow shutter speed. Hence, slow shutter speed are very good in low lighting situation. Here is another example of how you can show motion effect on waterfall or flowing water at a very slow shutter speed. So, if you want to show any kind of motion, you have to shoot it in slower shutter speed. But always remember that when you are shooting in slower shutter speed, you have to stabilize your camera on a tripod or any kind of stabilizing surface. Otherwise, it might generate camera shake, which results in image blur. We thank you for watching this session of Nikon DSLR tutorial. In the next session, we will be talking about relationship between shutter speed and aperture. Until next time, this is your Nikon buddy Abhishek Singh signing off.
How can I control exposure without modifying the aperture? How can I balance between aperture and shutter speed? What is ISO?
If you have question how shutter speed and aperture works together, this session will answer that question. Welcome all of you to another session of Nikon DSLR tutorials. In this session, we will be talking about relationship between shutter speed and aperture. Now, here is an image that has been shot at 1/60th of a second shutter speed and aperture f5.6. Now, you can see the overall exposure of the image is pretty decent, as well as you can see the background is slightly defocused. Now, if your intention is to bring more background in focus, you have to increase the f number, making the aperture further smaller. Once you do that, you will see the image will be underexposed. Reason being, you are cutting the amount of light entering the image sensor. Now, in order to compensate that, the second aspect that you need to change in your camera is the shutter speed. You need to slow down the shutter speed in order to increase the duration of light entering the image sensor. Now, once you slow down the shutter speed to 1/15th of a second and keep the same aperture, that is f11, you will see you will get more background in focus. That means you will have a greater depth of field and the same exposure as the first image. Now, let us take the same image again. Here you can see an image wherein the background is slightly defocused. Now, if you want to defocus the background furthermore or want a very good shallow depth of field, you need a wider aperture. Now, you need a wider aperture, that means you need smaller f number. Smaller f number of f2.8 is good enough to give you a very good shallow depth of field. Hence, at shutter speed 1/60th of a second and aperture f2.8, you will see you will get a very good shallow depth of field, but the exposure is overexposed. Now, in order to compensate that, what you need to do is you need to increase the shutter speed. Hence, you will see you will get a good shallow depth of field with a properly exposed image. As we have discussed the two components of exposure, that is aperture and shutter speed, now let us discuss the third component of exposure, which is called ISO. ISO is basically responsiveness of sensor towards light. Now, ISO setting can be changed in order to achieve much more brighter output without even changing the shutter speed and aperture. Now, let us see how ISO works. Here you can see an image which is very dark. Now, if you want to achieve an output which is bright without even changing the shutter speed and aperture or without even using a flash, you can actually increase the various numbers of ISO in the camera settings. Now, these numbers in some cameras starts from 50, in some cameras it starts from 100 and goes up to 3200, 6400 and in high end bodies to 25600. Now, as you increase these numbers, you will see you tend to increase the brightness of the image. Now, as we explained to you earlier, the relationship between shutter speed and aperture and how these two elements can combine together to get you a properly exposed image. Now, if you do not want to change shutter speed and aperture, but yet want a proper exposed image, let us see how ISO helps in that. Now, here is an image that has been shot at 1/60th of a second with aperture f5.6. Now, in order to get more background in focus, the element that we will change in our camera would be aperture. So, we increase the f number to f11 so that we get a smaller aperture. Once we do that, the image tends to appear underexposed. Now, in order to balance the exposure, what we will do is we will simply increase the ISO number to 800. So that we get a very good exposed photograph without even changing the shutter speed or aperture. Now, let us see some of the examples of various ISO settings. These settings will tell you in what kind of situation what kind of ISO number can be used. In brightly lit situations, especially in daylight, ISO 100 can give you good output. In shade situation wherein your subject is under the influence of shade, ISO 200 will be sufficient enough to give you great output. If you are shooting something that is moving very fast in the outdoor, ISO 400 may be sufficient to grab a good exposure. If you are shooting some stage activity or some kind of stage show, ISO 800 is sufficient enough to give you great output. Similarly, if you are shooting in a very low lighting situation, especially at night, ISO 1600 can give you very good output. Now, if you are shooting something that is in very low lighting situation wherein there is no light, then ISO 3200 or more can give you better output. Now, let me just give you a brief idea about relationship between ISO and shutter speed. Higher ISO ensures faster response towards light, hence faster shutter speed can be used. Now, why you want to use faster shutter speed? In order to freeze the subject. Now, in order to freeze the subject, once you increase the shutter speed, you will notice that image tends to appear underexposed as shown onto your screen. Now, in order to compensate that underexposure, you need to increase the ISO to correct the exposure. So, you boost the ISO number to get properly exposed image. Now, you might ask me a question, why not we use higher ISO always? To answer that, lowest possible ISO given by your camera is the best output in that particular ISO. That means, if you are shooting at ISO 100 or 200, the image quality that comes in that particular ISO would be far more better than the ISO used 3200 or 6400. Now, at 3200 or 6400, you might see noise and grains on the image. Now, to make you understand in a better way, let us have a look at various images shot at different ISO settings. ISO 200, ISO 400 till ISO 1600, you won't see any kind of noise or grains on the image. That means the image quality is simply impeccable. But when you increase the ISO to 3200 or to further 6400, you might see little bit of grains and noise on the image. If you intend to print an image canvas size and exhibit your image, we recommend to you to shoot at the lowest ISO possible. We thank you for watching this session of Nikon DSLR tutorial, and we hope you enjoyed the session. In the next session, we will be talking about various exposure control modes